In previous lectures, we discussed the idea that because of energetic and nutritional needs, birds don't want to overlap molting and reproduction. And for birds that are migratory, that also includes migration. So we're going to look at annual cycles and how birds regulate the timing of each of these important aspects of their annual cycle. So again, the key events in the annual cycle of many birds is reproduction, molting, and in some at least, migration. Every single one of these is very energetically expensive and requires really accurate timing and scheduling and partitioning so that there's minimal overlap between them. So, for example, reproduction can take an extra 50% in its needs for energy. Because when we talk about reproduction, we're not talking about just the production of young and the production of eggs and females, although that is costly. But we're talking about courtship displays, territory defense, that egg production I mentioned, and then once they hatch, then the real work begins, and that's parental care. So let's use yellow warblers as an example. I'm going to kind of walk you through this chart here. This is a chart from a website that you have access to through the library. It's called the Birds of North America. And it has this great kind of description of everything we know about every species of North American bird. And one of the charts that's listed in each of them is this kind of wheel-like diagram that talks about these major aspects of the timing of each key behavior in the annual cycle. So I'm going to use the yellow warbler here as an example. These should start arriving here pretty soon in Texas, and they're one of my favorite warblers. All right, well, let's start off with this inner ring. This inner ring is the molt. We've already talked about molt, so notice that this molt bar here is a single, but we have two bars here. What's going on there? Well, remember, one molt only replaces the body feathers, the contour feathers. Typically, in most birds, there is an additional molt that replaces the contour feathers, but also replaces the flight feathers. All right, so just by telling you that, you should remember that the pre-alternate molt is the one that's the partial molt. So this is January, February, March. So these birds are getting their bright coloration, but they're not getting new flight feathers. Now, a single bird is not going to be molting during this entire time. This is like looking at it from a species point of view, and different individuals and different populations are going to be doing it at slightly different times. However, if you look at how that relates to this next bar here on the outer ring, this is migration. So notice that molt has very minimal overlap with a very small number of individuals that begin molting. And actually, in this situation, these early migrating individuals, probably the ones that molted way back here, right? So they're getting the molt out of the way so that they can migrate earlier than most individuals in their species. But again, most are going to be migrating right here, and that's when the molt is finished for virtually everybody in the population. All right, so April, May, some late arrivals in June. We'll talk about the dire consequences for reproduction to late migrants in this situation, which is oftentimes linked to the fact that they were kind of late in the molt. That's going to be one of the keys. You don't want to get kind of behind in this annual cycle because it kind of puts you behind the 8 ball for all of the cycles to come. Well, once migration is finished, then you can start reproducing. That's what this middle ring here is showing. And what we see here is first the production of eggs, and then raising the young in the nest. And again, you're not going to be able to, most birds that are laying eggs are just focusing on that. Usually we're going to see that birds have synchronous hatching of young, so they would cleanly move into this phase. So this overlap here again is a populational thing. And so the individuals that are laying eggs early here are the ones that have the nestlings first here. But notice, then you begin that, then you start going through your complete molt, the pre-basic. And again, the individuals here that are molting first are the individuals that finish reproduction. There may be just a little bit of overlap between when they're feeding young that are, say, flying away from the nest. Individuals oftentimes are molting at that point. So there's a minimal amount of overlap. But they're unlikely to do much molting while the young are still in the nest. Okay, and then again, it's really important to get that molt out of the way before you go into the fall migration. So what are some of the consequences of individuals that do get behind the 8 ball. Maybe try to overlap some of these. Here's a great study of American redstarts that looked at this. And this study found that individuals that nested early and were successful, or ironically, those individuals that tried to nest early and they were unsuccessful and they just gave up for that year, they were likely to complete their molt prior to the fall migration. So they didn't have any overlap between trying to molt and get migration going. Now the consequences of this was that they were able to molt these bright orange and dark black flight feathers, as you can see here. These are American redstarts. Again, this is something we'll see migrating through here. And usually the first week of May is the best time in Nacogdoches. Down on the Gulf Coast, mid to late April, you'll start picking these up. But notice they've got these striking black and orange patterns in the flight feathers. Okay, so that's important to realize. This is the basic molt, but in this species, you're getting these bright feathers during that complete pre-basic molt, I should say. A consequence of having this high-quality molt is they're more likely to have good success next year. The males are going to be more impressive to females, and so they're more likely to get a quality mate. And they're also more likely to be able to compete with other males in the population for territories. Well, what about individuals that kind of nested late and kind of get behind that 8 ball? Well, they have to complete the molt while they're migrating. And that's what's being shown here. So we see that this is where they breed in North America. You see that there's this partial molt, spring migration, but then the breeding. Let's kind of focus on the breeding here. So the breeding is happening in the spring and summer. Again, here we have individuals that complete their molt. Here's the fall migration. These individuals have completed their molt before migration happens. But you see that there's some individuals here that are at varying stages of molting late and overlapping with migration. What this results in is as they're molting, because they're energetically stressed and nutritionally stressed, they produce feathers that are not this striking orange and black contrast. Their feathers are lighter and less contrasting. The result of this is when they get on the wintering ground, they have to fight for territories as well. And they're less likely to get a good wintering ground. Well, guess what? Again, if you've got a less successful wintering ground, you're not going to be in a good position to get your pre-alternate molt going and then also have enough energy for spring migration. So they tend to be late in spring migration. So they get to the breeding ground. All the territories are already picked over. They get the lowest quality ones, if they get one at all. And they also tend to be, the males at least, tend to be the individuals that the females prefer least. So if they do breed, they breed later, and guess what? That puts them right back into this situation, if they're even going to make it another year. So, being very specific of when you do each of these 3 key events in the annual cycle is important. But how do birds do this? So what regulates the annual cycle? Well, birds do have a circannual rhythm. So this is a rhythm that is set by photoperiod changes for most temperate zone birds. So increasing day length triggers the release of pituitary hormones that kicks in preparation of the breeding cycle. So how do birds sense daylight changes? Well, they have these photosensory structures. The pineal gland at the dorsal aspect of the brain, shown here, and also the hypothalamus, which is connected to the pineal gland, can sense light, and this triggers the production of hormones in the pituitary gland. It turns out that the retina is also a way that birds can track photoperiod changes and track when day lengths are increasing and decreasing. Although it has been shown that they don't rely on the retina. Birds that are blind can still cycle successfully. So the pineal gland and the hypothalamus themselves are sufficient. Well, how do we know that it's increased daylight that's doing this, that's actually triggering this, that it is the proximate mechanism? Well, here's a classic study, a very old study on dark-eyed juncos, where the individual basically just took males in the population, collected them, measured their testes size at different dates. And so each of these represents a different individual. But you can see that as the days and months progress into May and June, that's when we have the largest testes. Remember, testes and the ovary in birds will cycle in size. But boy, as they're getting into reproduction, their testes are significantly increasing in weight and size. But again, this just says that they're doing it at the right time. It doesn't necessarily indicate that it's due to day length increases in the wild. How are you going to test that? Well, this individual actually just brought birds into the lab where you can control the daylight. And so here you can see in mid-winter, as long as you're increasing the daylight, so you're messing with daylight and temperature, you see that you can increase size of the testes. And here's just another time period in which both temperature and light were increased to show that you can get the increase in growth. So solar energy, light, and temperature were important in leading to these reproductive preparation changes. So it turns out that additional studies indicate that really light is the most important proximate mechanism, but temperature is important. So for example, snowmelt affects, kind of fine-tunes the gonadal growth patterns in American robins. In other species, rainfall is very important. This is particularly true of species that live in desert areas like Gambel's quail and zebra finches. And there may be a rainy season associated, like for example in Arizona, there's what we call the monsoon rainy season, which usually starts around the 1st of July. But the birds don't begin reproduction until the rainy season starts. In other species, particularly tropical species, it may be tied to specific dry or wet seasons. And that can vary depending on the diet of the birds. For example, hummingbirds and kingfishers tend to have their breeding peaks associated with the dry season. So a decrease in rainfall will trigger them to go into the reproductive cycle. Now, why would that be? Well, there are just more floral resources in the dry season. And for kingfishers, think about it. In the dry season, the ponds and the lakes are going to be smaller, and it's going to concentrate the fish so that they have a greater access to food to feed their young. In other species that have very specialized diets in their habitat, that can trigger the regulation of their breeding cycle, so it can be the proximate mechanism. So that's the case with pinion jays and crossbills. They track conifer growth patterns, and so the production of green cones that are beginning to ripen will trigger them to get into reproductive status. But why do birds breed when they do? Well, birds oftentimes want to breed at the right time of the year that has a good climate. So this could be temperature and rainfall. So temperature affects how long they have to stay on the eggs for incubation, and rainfall can limit their ability to find food and get off the nest to find food to provision the young at the nest. We found in some of the research that I've helped with red-cockaded woodpeckers that really rainy Mays are very bad for red-cockaded woodpecker reproduction. They tend to not go out and forage enough, and so young do not get as much food or regular food supplies in rainy seasons. So birds have been selected to breed oftentimes in the times of the year that are relatively warm and the rainfall amount is such that it minimizes problems with their feeding rate. However, in some species, predation risk may trump kind of some of the temperature. So, for example, if you are a species in which snakes are your primary reason why your nest would fall because of predation, well, if you can breed early, since you're an endotherm and homeothermic, before the snakes get really active, even though it's cold, that might be the thing to do. And that's what brown-headed nuthatches do, the bird shown here in the lower left. We found that they're breeding right now. So in February is when they start breeding, and clearly their number one threat for successful reproduction are snakes, particularly rat snakes. So if they can get things going before that, that's helpful. Now, how can they get away with that? Because it's still pretty cold. Well, these are cavity nesters. So by living in a cavity, you're a little insulated, and it helps you get away from that cold weather. Same thing for this Carolina chickadee shown here. Chickadees also are cavity nesters, and so they can breed earlier. But for most species, including the kingfisher that I mentioned earlier, the reason you breed when you do is its maximum time when food is available for feeding both you and for provisioning the young in your nest. And in most species of birds, this is linked to arthropod production. So, and typically insects. So when insects, larvae are the most abundant, like shown here with this chickadee, that's when you're going to time your reproduction such that nestlings, that the young, are produced when food is maximally available. So I kind of use the yellow warbler as an example of a species that is migratory, but it also has to molt twice a year and also has to reproduce. If you're a non-migrant species, what we call a resident species, you can actually stretch out your breeding season. So birds can do this by having more clutches per season. So for example, a northern cardinal, instead of just trying to rush in one nest, a lot of migrants, that's all they can do is one nesting attempt, maybe two in rare circumstances. But a northern cardinal can nest up to 4 times per year. Again, because they don't have to squeeze in the energetically expensive phases of fall migration and spring migration. And some birds actually don't even have a yearly pattern. So some seabirds have a fairly regular pattern, but it's a non-seasonal pattern. So they tend to breed every 8 to 10 months, just because they have a relatively stable supply of food, and they can recover from one breeding attempt to the other and squeeze in molts in a faster than an annual cycle. On the other hand, some really large birds may actually skip a year to recoup some of the high cost of reproduction associated with the very large eggs that they produce. And we'll see that in some of these larger birds, they have the potential to live for a long time. And this is a major life history aspect that we'll talk about later. If you have the potential to live a long time, you don't want to try to push your luck by breeding too intensely early on if it might increase your chances of dying at an early age. In some species like brown pelicans, when you breed depends on exactly where you live. So, for example, if you look at their reproduction, it varies latitudinally. So up in the north, they want to avoid the winter weather, and they also want to avoid breeding during hurricane season. But as you go south into the tropics, you see that they have a more spread out reproductive pattern and can breed at virtually any time of year. So in this lecture, we've talked a lot about the cost of migration. But in the next 2 lectures, we're going to focus on migration itself and why birds do it and how they accomplish that task.